Okay, in this lecture we will examine the components of blood and describe blood's role as one of your body's connective tissues. We will define circulation and briefly outline the flow of blood through the body. We will examine blood's intimate connection with respiration, and we will describe the role of hemoglobin as carrier of both oxygen and carbon dioxide. So let's get started. So what comes to your mind when you hear the word blood? Now, most of us generally think of that red viscous liquid that comes out of us when we say get a paper cut. Well, that for sure is blood, but blood is so much more than a paper cut. You have probably been to a physician for physical or perhaps for some other reason and had a specimen of blood drawn. Now, if the lab technician takes your tube of blood and spins it down in a centrifuge, it will look something like this. Now we say that this blood specimen has been separated or fractionated. So if we look at your fractionated blood graphically then, it will look something like this, where we see that plasma makes up about 55% of your total blood volume. Now plasma is the clear fluid matrix of blood, which is slightly denser than water due to the dissolved proteins contained within. Now less than 1% of your blood's volume is this buffy coat. The buffy coat consists of leukocytes. Leuko means white. Cyte means cell. So leukocytes are your white blood cells, or WBCs, and platelets. Platelets are your blood's clotting elements. So erythrocytes make up about 45% of your blood's volume. Now erythro means red, and cyte again means cell. So these are your red blood cells, or RBCs. Now, by the way, leukocytes, platelets, and erythrocytes are together referred to as the formed elements of your blood. So let's look at the erythrocyte. Now remember that erythrocytes are red blood cells, or RBCs. There are about 260 million red blood cells in one drop of your blood. Now red blood cells outnumber white blood cells about 1,000 to 1. Recall that the buffy coat, that's leukocytes and platelets, make up less than 1% of the formed elements of blood, so some 99.9% of formed elements are erythrocytes. So that means that 1/3 of all cells in the human body are red blood cells. Now erythrocytes are extremely uniform in size and shape, as you can see from this image. Red blood cells are disc-shaped with a diameter of about 7.5 micrometers. Red blood cells are biconcave discs. Now, red blood cells remind me of donuts with their holes not punched all the way through. No? Okay. Now, when I teach this segment live, I give my students these hard cinnamon disc candies. They are exactly the same shape as red blood cells. No, again? Well, then if we look at an erythrocyte in cross-section, we see that each side of the cell is indented. These indentations are called concavities, and there are 2 of them, one on each side. So we describe erythrocytes as being biconcave. Finally, red blood cells are anuclear. Now, anytime you put an A in the front of the word, it means without. So anuclear means without a nucleus. Human red blood cells do not have nuclei, which means that they cannot divide like most other cells in the body. Now, because they cannot replicate, they must be constantly replaced by the body. So red blood cells then have a lifespan of about 120 days. Due to its unique shape and structure, remember that red blood cells are anuclear, biconcave discs. Erythrocytes have several very important qualities. First, red blood cells are extremely flexible. In other words, they are able to bend and fold on themselves, which allows them to very easily squeeze through tiny spaces, well, like capillaries, which can be as narrow as 4 micrometers. 2, red blood cells have the unique ability to stack themselves like dinner plates. These stacks, known as rouleaux, form and dissociate spontaneously, allowing, for example, a whole stack of red blood cells to pass through a very narrow blood vessel. Now, without their ability to stack, red blood cells would clump together and actually block blood flow through narrow vessels. And so here is a pretty cool image of a rouleau. Finally, red blood cells have the special ability to absorb blood gases, namely oxygen and carbon dioxide. More on that in a moment. Very rapidly, in fact, an ability important to your very survival. So the most important function of the red blood cell is that of transporting respiratory gases, namely oxygen, chemical designation is O2, and carbon dioxide, that's CO2. Now the tool that the erythrocyte uses for this purpose is the protein hemoglobin. So here's a graphical rendition of hemoglobin. I'll try not to get too biochemistry on you. That's beyond the scope of this course. There are a few things you want to appreciate about hemoglobin. First, hemoglobin is a comparatively large globular protein. It is composed of 4 separate protein chains, designated alpha, there are 2 alpha chains, and beta, there are 2 beta chains, that are subsequently linked together. Now each chain contains a heme group. Heme comes from the Greek for blood and refers to the iron-containing molecule embedded in the protein. Now these iron-containing molecules are what gives your blood its rich red color, by the way. Okay, iron, that's Fe2+, is important to the proper functioning of erythrocytes, as it is this iron that binds both oxygen and carbon dioxide, and we'll look at this closer in a moment. In any course like this one, there are certain major concepts that you should retain. That is to say, you should never leave a course like this one without having an appreciation of the big picture. Now, I refer to these major concepts as umbrella concepts. One such umbrella lesson is this: respiration is the process of inhaling oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide. Now hold on to that thought. Now keeping the big picture in mind, that is, you inhale oxygen and you exhale carbon dioxide, it will seem initially like I'm off topic, but stay with me here. So you inhale air, which is rich in oxygen. And by the way, all of these symbols are red for a reason. Now the air is scrubbed as it passes over the nasal conchae. The clean air passes through the area of the nasopharynx, through the oropharynx, and into the airway proper via the larynx. You're familiar with this process already. Now the air travels down the trachea and into the lungs. As the air enters your lungs, there are millions of beautiful red blood cells waiting. Now here we see the intimate relationship between the respiratory and circulatory systems. You really can't discuss one without referencing the other. So remember that erythrocytes have in them the globular protein hemoglobin. I'm showing you one large hemoglobin molecule here for the sake of simplicity. In fact, 95% of the protein content of a red blood cell is hemoglobin. So as you now know, hemoglobin has an affinity for oxygen. So each hemoglobin molecule is able to absorb and carry 4 units of oxygen. Recall that each hemoglobin has 4 iron molecules embedded. Now once your red blood cells are loaded up with oxygen, we say that your blood is oxygenated. Now remember that term. So the oxygenated or good blood leaves the lungs and returns to the heart. Once filled with good blood, the heart contracts, sending the oxygenated blood to all parts of the body, up to your brain, down to your big toe, and every part in between, by way of your arterial circulation. So the first major point to remember here is arteries carry oxygenated blood to all parts of the body. So here's a question for you. What happens to all of that oxygen once it reaches your tissues? That is, your brain, or your kidneys, or your muscles, or your big toe even. Now remember how we started this discussion. Respiration is a process of inhaling oxygen and exhaling carbon dioxide. Well, your cells do the same thing. Mind you, cells do not actually inhale and exhale, but they use up the oxygen and in the process generate the waste product, you guessed it, carbon dioxide. And that process on the cellular level is called cellular respiration. So we can tweak this umbrella concept just a little and say that cellular respiration is when your cells use oxygen and produce the waste product, carbon dioxide. So let's see what happens down at the big toe. An artery carries the oxygenated blood into your foot. Recall that each red blood cell contains hemoglobin, and each hemoglobin molecule is loaded down with oxygen. Now the tissues of the foot, say this skeletal muscle here, need oxygen in order to function properly. So the oxygen in your blood dissociates from hemoglobin and gets absorbed by the skeletal muscle. As the skeletal muscle uses up the oxygen, carbon dioxide is produced as a waste product. Now remember that hemoglobin has an affinity for carbon dioxide as well. And because erythrocytes don't like to travel around empty, they absorb all of that carbon dioxide produced by the skeletal muscle. The erythrocytes no longer carry oxygen, and we can now say that your blood is deoxygenated. Now notice here that I changed the color of the erythrocyte to blue. This is a common convention in anatomy sources, that is, to denote oxygenated or arterial blood in red and deoxygenated or venous blood in blue. So the deoxygenated blood enters your venous circulation, leaves your foot, and returns to the heart. Deoxygenated blood returns to your heart by way of your venous circulation. So that is the second major point to remember about circulation. Your veins carry deoxygenated blood. And when your heart contracts again, all of that deoxygenated blood returns to the lungs. Now back in the lungs, carbon dioxide dissociates from hemoglobin, enters the trachea, travels up the airway, and you exhale. And the big picture is complete as you exhale carbon dioxide. Okay, let's take a deep breath. So what are the important concepts that you want to glean from this lecture? First, your circulatory system is intimately connected to your respiratory system. I say, in fact, circulation and respiration are two sides of the same coin. Respiration is when you inhale oxygen and exhale carbon dioxide. Cellular respiration, then, is when your cells use up oxygen and they produce carbon dioxide as a waste product. Hemoglobin has an affinity for both oxygen and carbon dioxide. Remember that hemoglobin is the erythrocyte's tool for carrying oxygen and carbon dioxide. And finally, arteries carry oxygenated or good blood. We call that arterial circulation. And veins carry deoxygenated or bad blood. We call that venous circulation. Okay, so in the next lecture, we will differentiate the three types of blood vessels. So I will see you shortly.